Hey everyone, my name's Matt and I'm an Australian who's been living in Colombia for the last 6 years. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the topic of forgiveness today. Thomas Zaza, a Hungarian American psychiatrist, is quoted as saying, "The stupid neither forgive nor forget. The naive forgive and forget. The wise forgive but do not forget." Now I wanted to start by posing this question. What comes to mind when you think of the word forgiveness? However, after exploring this topic further, I believe a better question to pose is, what do you feel when you hear the word forgiveness? Because forgiveness is the intersection between the point of hurting and the process of healing, it involves more than just the mind. It engages the entire being. There is no universal approach to forgiveness. Depending on your cultural, religious, and social influences, forgiveness will take different forms and have differing definitions. For some, the intensity of the harm and hurt will impact the process of forgiveness. Perhaps it's an immediate choice, followed by a process toward feeling. Perhaps it's a process to arrive at feelings before the choice can be made. Perhaps it's independent of the transgressor, or it's entirely dependent on the transgressor. Vernon C. Kelly Jr. states that although we all share a universal set of effects that motivate everything, our behaviors that follow depend on the social scripts that have been formed in each of us as a result of our own personal and cultural backgrounds. Countries like the US or UK have more individualistic cultures, which means they often put personal gain before helping the wider group. It's about how I feel. Asia and Africa are collectivistic cultures that aim to put the well-being of the community ahead of self. It's about how the community experiences harmony. So what form forgiveness takes depends on our unique social scripts. We're all linked by our human nature to care, but our relationships can be messy, damaged, or broken. Therefore, we're constantly faced with the decision of whether we will work toward healing. Forgiveness is the bridge we must choose to cross if we want to move from hurt to healing. In Chapter 5, Katie Hutchinson shares her personal story of forgiveness after experiencing tragedy in her life. One night, while breaking up a fight at a friend's house, her husband was brutally murdered. At the time, Katie lived in a small town and was the mother of 5-year-old twins. But despite living in a small town, the community stayed silent, and it took over 5 years of investigation before a suspect was charged. During this time, Katie's personal journey of forgiveness was connected to the community's own reaction and response to the murder, but also to how Katie chose to respond. Katie recalls the reactions of those around her after her husband was murdered. The very next day after the murder, a reporter asked her, "What do you want to happen to the murderer?" as if expecting to hear a response that involved some kind of vengeful retribution. She also states, "It amazed me how quickly someone would say, 'If I were in your shoes,' as if they could understand for a moment what I was experiencing." Katie says, "My decisions became the subject of public scrutiny, and my choices of how I chose to respond led to some friendships ending, others withdrawing, others suffering depression, whilst others avoided the situation altogether, masking their feelings of pain with substance abuse." But what kind of personal response could impact others in such profound and powerful ways? What did Katie want to happen to the murderer? Well, Katie recalls her initial feelings after learning of her husband's murder. "I felt sick, but I wanted to know that whoever killed my husband was going to be okay. I wanted to understand how my community had failed the murderer. I felt responsible. I imagined the mother of the murderer. I wanted to comfort her and imagined her reciprocating. I cared deeply that the family on the other end of this tragedy was going to be taken care of." Katie tried to focus on moving forward because this enabled her to feel a sense of control. She considered what might happen if she gave into negative and dark emotions. She felt that if she gave into rage and hate, it would dominate her life, and her children who had lost their father would also lose their mother in this process too. She had already been a witness to the negative coping strategies of her own family, who dealt with grief through substance abuse. She did not want to follow a similar path. After moving her family away from the community where her husband was murdered, she was able to start a new life and build new relationships, routines, and belonging which formed new strong attachment scripts. However, the lingering burden of not knowing the truth about her husband's murder caused ongoing anguish for her and her children. Finally, after 5 years of investigating, the police charged the suspect. Katie wanted to meet the suspect. She was encouraged to let the system do its job. However, she needed to see the suspect, who was a young man named Ryan. She needed to hear from him and for him to hear from her. She knew that the procedures of the justice system that lay ahead would not answer the questions her family had surrounding the murder. Katie thought, who better to ask the questions than herself? As we've learned in the discussion of the ownership of conflict, modern criminal justice systems deprive victims, offenders, and communities from participation in their own conflicts. Katie wasn't willing to let this happen and felt responsible for advocating on behalf of her children to find answers and share their stories. What lay ahead was a remarkable journey founded on Katie's desire to know that Ryan and his family were going to be okay. Katie shared with Ryan about who her husband was and how his act had impacted her and her children. This enabled her to hear from Ryan and witness his response to what she shared. Over time, Katie met with Ryan and heard his story. He shared how his upbringing was marked by trauma, abuse, lack of belonging, and the lack of healthy attachments. Although she hated the actions of Ryan, she couldn't bring herself to hate the person. Katie's ability to separate the deed from the doer allowed her to experience the reintegrative shame discussed in this week's lecture that rejects Ryan's actions, yet desires to see Ryan restored to the community. Katie shares that her journey to forgiveness was organic, dynamic, and practical. It was a way of giving herself a mission to create a hopeful future. She states that forgiveness is not a one-off offering, but rather a dynamic process that is necessary to revisit occasionally. Just as grief endures, so too does her willingness to embrace forgiveness continue to be tested. Katie's now an advocate for restorative practices within educational systems, in order for young people to grow within a supportive community. She speaks to school-aged children and young people as well as educators about the power of restorative practices and helps victims to move through trauma toward healing. So as we can see, forgiveness is complex. It's influenced by our own personal scripts and may never take the same form of another's process of forgiving. Healing is possible, but it may not look the same to each person. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Peace.